within a full SAP system, you can also divide your SAP systems in different clients. There can be a client 100, there can be a client 000, there can be a client 400, there can be a client 800, and you can also create your own clients. Okay. Generally, in most of the projects, you would be finding it when it is a live project. For one production system, we have only one single client. Most of the big companies, they would not be going with the client-based approach. So SAP give you a SAP system with some standard configuration. And that standard configuration sits in the 000 client. 90% or the 90, I would say the 90% of the work which you do in SAP is a client specific. Would be a client specific. You will see, I will talk about some tables today. When you create a data in SAP, you will go into the table. In the table, there would be a field for client, that this material which you have created, the material 10001, which is salt, is belong to client 100. So most of the configurations under this client only, you would be having, generally when we talk about the enterprise structure also, we talk about client at top, and then we have a company code. Company code and below thing is a business hierarchy. But when we talk about the client is basically your technical hierarchy. So all the data sits under the client, which means if you are working on client 100, you have created a material 1001. In the database, it is stored for client 100. You can work on client 800 and you can create a material again, which has been already created. You can create them again. And you can create as a sugar. So the same material in this client is actually sugar, and the same material in this client is actually a salt. Actually, this name has been given as a client because it was thought that when SAP was created, with this differentiation, a big company would be having, or one consulting company would be able to give the server, and then the multiple different clients would be able to use it. This can be Tata Steel. And this can be your Reliance. That was the reason in 1970s when SAP was created, this client, it was named as a client. Otherwise, SAP was thinking that they would be having a big server and they would be creating multiple different clients and they will give it to a different client. Tata Steel is using 100, Reliance is using 800. But that approach never worked. Okay, we all, you know, that when you will ask that, why do we call it as a client? In the top, we have a client, we have a company code. Client, we means that the customer, right? Why it is called a client? You need to think about that. It's a technical architecture. Why it was called as a client? Because when they built the SAP server, the thought process was that this differentiation they will give, because when you give somebody a client access right now, you also have a access to client 100, right? In this server, we have a client 000 also. We have a client 800 also. What is there in client 100, 000? What is there in client 800? You don't know, because there is a complete separation of the data. There is a complete separation of the configuration also. Okay, complete separation of the data, complete separation of the configurations are there at the client level. What is happening at client 800, you will not be able to see when you're logging with client 100 because it's complete separation. So this one client can actually work as a separate system. So initial approach of giving it as a Tata Steel, giving it a Reliance did not work because all the companies are big. They don't want to share the data. They don't want to have ownership of data with the SAP or one company, and then they are giving the access. That thing did not work. People are very particular. The sizes are big, and the people are also very particular about their data. So that approach never worked. Then, but the client approach is still there. You can have a separate client in SAP system, which can be used for the different purposes. Then SAP come up with another thing that, okay, the client is there where the separation of can be done. This can be a separate master data. This can be a separate, this 000 is called as a golden client from SAP, where SAP standard configurations would be there. If you have changed in 100 client, also SAP standard configuration comes. But if you have changed that configuration, and if you want to refer what was the configuration given by SAP, you can always refer from the 000 client. Only basis people would be having access to it. Okay, basis people would be having access to it. And there are the opportunities available. You can copy these configurations from 000 client and you can move to 100 client. You can also move this configuration. Basis team has those transactions by which they would be able to move particular configuration. They would be also be able to compare the configuration and move it from one client to another client if somebody has changed the configuration. Okay. Second approach SAP came up. Let's do one thing. Let's work. We can break it this one. We can create it client 100. Client 100 is kind of a development client where all the developments is happening. And then you can take your configurations. You can move your configurations when you release the configuration from one client to another client. You can have a client 200, which is your quality system, where you will be doing the testing. And you can create a client 511, which would be acting as your training system. So you can have a multiple different systems where basically you can do a client to client copy. The full client 200 can be copied into the client 500. And this you would be using it as a training system. You have given open access to the people to play around. When they are creating any sales order, purchase order, they are changing any master data or anything, it's not impacting this client. This client data is intact because the data interchange between the client are there with the special transaction, not the end user would be able to do it. Even functional consultant would also not be able to do it, right? That separation came up. But that separation also has been adopted. Still, it has been adopted. I have seen some companies, not for the quality system, but the training system, rather than putting a separate training system, they will just do a client copy. They will create a new client, and that new client access has been given for the end users to do the training to get their training done. Okay, because trainers need to create a specific data sets for them, which they don't want to disturb with the other people when they are doing the training. So a separate training client has been created. So this approach also, the big companies, rather than putting a separate client, as we saw about the landscape, in the landscape, they would be having separate development, separate quality, and separate production systems. Okay. One more thing that why the separate system has been taken when we talk about the client, how the SAP client has been created, why the separate system has been taken. One of the reason is there is a 90% things are common, but when it comes to SAP development, when it comes to the ABAP code, they share the ABAP code. ABAP code is not different. Configurations can be different. 99% configurations are different. 100% of the master data is different. 100% of the transaction code would be different in each client. But there is a single ABAP code, which means if you do some enhancement, are your workbench request. If you do ABAP code and that ABAP code is moving to this system, it will move for full this system. It will altogether move for this full system. You cannot see that this workbench request would be only applicable for client 100 or this workbench request would be only applicable for client 800. So if you have separate development, separate quality system, whenever you are doing some changes into the development, your quality system would also be impacted. Your training system would also be impacted. That impact you cannot restrict because the ABAP requests are the workbench requests, which would be impacting all of the clients. That was the reason that this client approach is not used by the companies. They want to have a separate system because their workbench request, if they are testing it for one country, another country has some development and it is half cooked, they want to develop it, they want to check it, but this half cooked thing is impacting their existing UAT, which is happening for another country. A lot of disturbance will happen, right? That's why this client-based approach is not used that well. Always in, if I talk about the projects I have worked, always the different development quality production servers has been used rather than using a different clients. When it comes to the golden client, where basically all the company's configurations would be saved, for that also, rather than having a separate client, it is called, this is a golden client, but that is also a golden server, separate box has been created for it. Okay, very few people are able to explain this client related things. Okay, generally I talk about when I talk about the enterprise structure, but I have explained you here itself because the question was asked. With that explanation, you should be very thorough about what is the client and what configuration would be common for the client. There are the configurations, which is a basis configuration, where basically some configuration, which would be, you would be getting a warning, boss, don't do this change. Stop it. Whatever the change you are doing is a cross client change. It would be impacting all of the clients. There are few configuration, I would say that 2% or less than 1% configurations are there, which would be impacting across the client. The configurations like your country configuration. You create your countries, you create your regions, you create your time zones, right? And you create a country dependent parameters, not you as a basis team. So they also do some configurations, and those configurations impact all of the clients. So there can be some configuration which can impact all of the clients. I hope with this explanation you would be thorough कि भैया client क्या है, and you would be able to explain in the interviews or everywhere where it has been asked about the client, you would be able to give a good explanation.